CSS has pseudo selector is supported across all modern web browsers, and in this video, I'm going to show you 10 examples of how you can start using it today. I'm CJ, welcome to Syntax. Now, all of the tips I'm going to show you originated from a tweet by Wes Boss. So he tweeted 10 CSS has tips, and then in episode 714 of Syntax, he discussed all of those tips with Scott. And I'm going to show you all the same tips, but I'm going to show you some real world examples, and all of the examples in code I'm showing you are going to be available at the link in the description. So you'll be able to play around with and kind of inspect every single thing that we talk about today. First, let's start with the basics. And the simple idea is select some parent element if it has some child element. So in this example, we're going to change the background color of a post if it has an iframe, if it has an audio, or if it has only an audio and not iframe. So in this example, you can see this post here is styled green because it only has an iframe inside of it. This next one is red because it has an audio element and an iframe inside of it. This next one is blue because it only has an audio element. And so here you're seeing us combine it with the not pseudo selector that says, if this post does not have an iframe and it does have audio, then change the background to blue. And then this last one doesn't apply to any, so it just has the default styles of a post. Next up, we're calling this the anywhere selector. And what this allows us to do is if something exists on the page, we will select some other thing on the page. So in this example, we are blurring the answers here of this question and answer set if this input box is checked. If we uncheck it, we are unblurring them. Also, we're changing the label of the checkbox. And it's important to note that we're not using any JavaScript in this example. It's all done with CSS has. So we say, if the body has an input with the blur answers class and it is checked, select all answer elements on the page. So all elements with the answer class and blur them out. We can see this in action if we click on any of our answer classes here. Right now, since it's checked, they have this class applied. But if we uncheck them and we take a look, they no longer have that class applied. And in order to change the label here, we're actually just changing the content using CSS. So we have that same has selector here. So if that input box is checked, then select the visibility label and change the content before that element. And then if it is not checked, select the visibility label and change it to show. And you'll notice here, we're again combining this with the not pseudo selector. So if the body does not have this element, then apply this class. We can kind of see that in action right here. So if we look at the before pseudo element, we can see that this is being applied. So it's changed the content to show. And then if we check it, it is now hide. This next example is also of the anywhere selector, and this is actually a real world use case that we're using on the Syntax website. And the idea is we have a nav that on every other page except for the home page, we want to show the logo. But when we're on the home page, this homepage hero section exists, so we want to hide that logo. And so you can see that example here in the nav. You can see the logo right now is actually display none because the homepage hero section exists. Also, we're changing the flex alignment of this nav here based on if that logo is in there or not. Because if the logo isn't in there, we actually want to flex end everything. Now, if we take a look at the about page, we'll see that the logo isn't hidden. And that's because the homepage hero section doesn't exist because we're on the about page. Also, the alignment of that nav flex box is just using its default style of space between now that the logo actually is displayed. Next up is the previous element selector, and developers have wanted to do this for so long. Literally, select me if I have some sibling. And it's super simple. So essentially what we do is we have the sibling selector here inside of the has. And so this says, if a div has a element with target class as a sibling, select this div. And so we can see right here, this div that we've selected based on the fact that its sibling has the target class, but we're actually selecting this div and then setting that yellow background. Next up are target layouts. And the idea here is you might want to change the layout of a CSS grid depending on its contents. And so this example comes from a slide deck that Wes was creating, where when a slide only has header elements, we want to set the grid to show the header element across all 4 cells. But if a slide has a header and an image, we want the header in the top 2 cells and the image in the bottom 2 cells. And then if a slide has a header and 2 images, we want the header in the top 2 cells and then each image spread across to those 2 separate cells. And we can see that in action here. So this first slide only has a header element inside of it, so it gets this specific grid template areas. This next slide has a header and an image, so it gets this grid template areas. And then this last slide has a header and then 2 images, so we give it this layout. Now, if those last examples didn't blow your mind, this one absolutely will. And so forever, we almost always have needed JavaScript to hide and show elements based on the validation status of an input, or change the background color of a label based on the validation status of an input. But now we can do it all with CSS. So everything I'm about to show you is just CSS. There's no JavaScript involved. And let me just talk about the example first before we dive into the code. So this input here is using browser form validation. We have min set to 0. But anytime you're using like min or max or pattern or required, those are things that are just built into the web browser. So here we have min set to 0. So if I put in a value that's negative, I'll need to blur the input to kick in the status of the validation. But if I blur the input, you'll see we are showing an error message and changing the background color to be red. And now that the input has been blurred, if I put in a valid input, we're changing the background to green and displaying a success message. And the field set example works in a similar way, except we are changing the border color instead of the background color. Now, the code to change the background color and the border color is fairly simple. We just say, in the case of the label, if the label has an input inside of it that has the user valid status. Now, user valid and user invalid are just built into the web browser. So if we're using these validation attributes on inputs, we just get those for free. We don't have to add those manually. Basically, when the user blurs the input, the browser is going to apply user valid or user invalid based on the validation status of that input. And so if it's valid, we're changing the background to green. If it's invalid, we're changing the background to red. Now, for the field set, very similar, but we're just changing the border left instead. Now, hiding and showing the success and error messages is a little more complicated, but it's doable. So in the case of a label, the elements with the success and error class are actually siblings. And so we are using the subsequent sibling selector, the tilde, to say if a label has an input that has the user valid status, so label has an input inside of it with the user valid status, then select the subsequent sibling with the success class and display it. If it has the user invalid status, select the subsequent sibling with the error class and display it. And by default, they are hidden. And for the field set, it's a little bit easier because those are actually nested inside the field set. So we don't have to use the tilde. We can just say, if a field set has an input with user invalid status, select the success element inside of that field set and display it. Or in the case of invalid, select the error element and display it. This next example will allow us to select all of the siblings of a hovered element. So here you can see if I hover over one of these, all of its siblings get a lower opacity. So that way the one we're hovering over stands out a little bit more. And the way that we do this is we first use the parent selector. So this says, select the cards element, which is the parent, that has a card inside of it that is currently being hovered. From there, select all cards inside of the cards element that are not being hovered and set their opacity to 0.2. So to see this in the dev tools here, if I select one of them and then trigger the hover class, now if I hover over any one of these other ones, you can see that it's applying that opacity to because they are not hovered inside of the parent container. This next example will allow us to select elements that have a given number of children. We're calling these quantity queries. So here we're saying if a card has at least 4 children, select that element and set the background to red. And so here we're using the child combinator in combination with the nth child selector. And you can see here that if an element has more than 4 children, in this case, they're just little divs, but if it has at least 4, then we are applying that red background, and 4 or more. So if it has 5 children, we're applying that red background as well. This next example is for selecting elements that have empty children. Now, this might be useful if you want to implement something like skeleton loaders, or maybe you just want to use it for debugging to kind of like highlight any elements on the page that are completely empty. So in this case, we are selecting any post that has any empty children. And again, we're using that child combinator, but this time we're using the empty pseudo class. And so here we can see that this post is selected because it has an empty H2. And in this case, we're just giving it a dotted red border color. This next example is for styling nested dropdowns. So if you ever have a list of, let's say like nav items, and one of those nav items has a nested list because it's going to be a nested dropdown, this will allow you to style that specific element to add like a drop-down arrow using CSS. And so here we are saying, select any list item inside of a nav that has a list inside of it. So here we can see we've got our main list, but then this one actually has a list inside of it. And from there, we want to select an anchor tag that has a list as the adjacent element. And then we're going to style using the after pseudo selector. So because this anchor tag has a list as the adjacent element, we're going to style it, and then in this case, put the drop-down arrow. Now, the reason we need this qualifier here is I don't want that drop-down arrow to appear on all of the children, so we're just applying it to the parent. This last example will allow you to select elements based on specific attributes. And this is a real-world example that comes from the Syntax branding webpage. So we have a bunch of different logos of various colors, but if a logo has black text inside of it, and both of these logos have transparent backgrounds, if this were to have a black background, we wouldn't be able to see that image at all. So what we want to do is select any asset element, which is the parent, and if it has an image inside of it whose src attribute has the word black inside of it, in this case, it's just a full-on URL with the word black. And if that's the case, change the background to white and the color to black. Now, those are all the examples I have for you. But like I said, everything I showed you will be available on the web. So check the link in the description. You can go there. You can play around with these examples. You can copy them to use them in your own apps. Now, if you found these useful, let us know down in the comments. Also, if you have some more interesting use cases for Has, I'd love to hear about it as well. And that's all for now. So I'll see you in the next one.